This story is a fictional work created for entertainment purposes. It does not depict real people events or official military actions. I am Bethany Collins, 29 years old, standing in full dress uniform beneath the Texas sun at Fort Cavazos in April of 2024, when I learned that honor can expose cruelty faster than any accusation ever could. The ceremony that was supposed to recognize my service became the moment my own family revealed who they truly were. The flags were perfectly aligned, snapping softly in the warm breeze, the formation tight and precise. The officers seated in crisp rows, while families filled the folding chairs behind them, whispering with pride and anticipation. I stood in line with my hands steady at my sides, my ribbons aligned, my boots polished until they reflected the sky, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to believe this day belonged to me. I did not look back at first because I already knew where they were sitting, third row slightly left. My father, Mark, rigid and silent. My stepmother, Linda, composed in the way only practiced judgment can be. And beside her, my stepbrother, Evan Collins, leaning back with a careless smirk as if this were a casual performance staged for his amusement. I felt his eyes on me long before I heard his voice low and mocking, drifting just far enough to reach my ears and make my stomach tighten. I told myself not today, not here, not in front of the uniform that had carried me through years of sacrifice. The announcer spoke about duty and quiet leadership, about service without expectation, and each word felt like a test I had already passed. I thought about the nights overseas when sleep came in fragments, about the responsibility of leading younger soldiers who trusted me without question, and about the discipline that had rebuilt me piece by piece after a childhood where respect was conditional. This award was not a trophy, it was acknowledgement, and I stood taller because of it. Then Evan laughed, not loud enough to interrupt the program, but loud enough to sting, and I heard him mutter something about medals and pretending to be important. My jaw tightened, but I stayed still because soldiers learn early that composure is a weapon. What he did not know, what none of them knew yet, was that this ceremony was not only about me. As the line moved forward, an older officer near the front shifted unsteadily, and without thinking, I stepped out to help him steady his footing, guiding him with the same instinct I had used 100 times before. The moment should have passed unnoticed. A simple act of courtesy, but behind me a chair scraped and Evan scoffed louder now, calling it showing off. I felt the air change the way it does before a storm, and every instinct told me something was about to break. I did not know yet that the man I was assisting carried authority that outranked every whispered insult. I did not know that one calm voice from the commanding officer would turn humiliation into justice. I only knew that my family believed they still owned the narrative, and that belief was about to collapse in front of everyone. If you have ever been humiliated by the people who were supposed to stand for you, at the moment it mattered most, then you will understand what happened next. The ceremony unfolded with the slow, deliberate precision that only the military knows how to execute. And as I stood in line waiting for my name to be called, I could feel every second stretching tight with anticipation. The sun sat high above Fort Cavazos, warming the broad parade field, where rows of folding chairs faced the stage, and beyond them the American flag moved steadily in the breeze, its colors sharp against the Texas sky. The brass band had already finished their opening piece, leaving behind a silence that carried weight rather than emptiness. And the master of ceremonies spoke in a calm, practiced tone about duty, sacrifice, and leadership. I stood at attention with my eyes forward, shoulders squared, spine straight, the familiar posture grounding me the way it always had. My dress uniform felt heavier than usual, not because of the fabric or the medals already pinned to my chest, but because of the people sitting behind me. I did not need to turn around to know exactly where they were, because their presence had always been something I sensed rather than saw. Linda Collins, my stepmother, sat rigid with her hands folded neatly in her lap, her expression carefully neutral in the way that suggested judgment rather than pride. She had perfected that look over the years, the one that said she was present only because appearances demanded it. Beside her, my father, Mark Collins, stared straight ahead, jaw tight, shoulders slightly hunched as if trying to make himself smaller to avoid being noticed. He had mastered silence as a defense, a way of avoiding conflict by pretending it did not exist. And then there was Evan, my stepbrother leaning back with one ankle resting casually over his knee. His posture relaxed, almost bored, like a man waiting for an intermission. Even from the front, I could hear him occasionally clearing his throat or letting out a quiet scoff that made my stomach tighten. I had learned long ago how to compartmentalize moments like this, to put them in a box and lock it away until the task at hand was complete. Soldiers survive by doing that, by focusing on what is in front of them rather than what threatens from behind. The officer to my left shifted his weight slightly, and the line moved forward one step closer to the stage. I glanced briefly at the award citation printed neatly on the program: Army Commendation Medal for Sustained Meritorious Service and Leadership During Operational Deployment. It was not the highest award one could receive, but it was earned honestly through years of quiet work, mentoring younger soldiers, coordinating logistics, and making decisions when no one else wanted to. I had never chased recognition, but standing there, I allowed myself one small private moment of pride. This was tangible proof that my efforts mattered, even if my family had never acknowledged them. As another name was called and applause rippled through the crowd, I felt Evan lean forward behind me and whisper something under his breath. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough to recognize the tone, the same one he had used since we were teenagers when he wanted to belittle without being confronted. It sounded like a joke about medals and pretending to be important, and I felt the familiar heat rise in my chest. Linda did not shush him. She never did. Instead, she tilted her head slightly toward him, lips tightening in a way that suggested agreement rather than disapproval. My father shifted in his seat, eyes dropping to the ground, as if the grass beneath his feet suddenly required his full attention. That small gesture hurt more than the whisper because it was confirmation of something I had always known. Silence can be just as cruel as words. The announcer paused briefly to adjust his notes, and in that quiet space, I felt the weight of years pressing in. I remembered being a child standing in similar silence, waiting for acknowledgement that never came, waiting for approval that was always reserved for Evan. He had been the golden child, the one whose mistakes were excused and whose achievements were exaggerated, while I was praised only for being reliable. Even now, decades later, nothing had changed. I was still the responsible one, the dependable one, the one expected to endure without complaint. The line advanced again, and I found myself just 2 soldiers away from the stage. The commanding officer stood near the podium, his presence calm and authoritative, watching each recipient with measured attention. I focused on him instead of the third row, drawing strength from the certainty of structure and order. In the military, there are rules, expectations, and consequences, and I had built my life around that clarity. Behind me, however, the rules were different. Their sarcasm passed for humor and neglect passed for normalcy. Evan whispered again, louder this time, and I heard a few heads turn. My cheeks burned, but I did not react because reacting had never changed anything. It only gave him what he wanted. I kept my eyes forward and my breathing steady, reminding myself that I had survived far worse than a few words. The band sat motionless, instruments resting on their laps, the polished brass catching the sunlight, and the crowd settled into a tense hush. I could feel the moment approaching like the slow drumbeat before contact. Part of me hoped that once my name was called, everything would quiet down, that the weight of the ceremony would force my family into respectful silence. Another part of me knew better. As the soldier ahead of me stepped forward, I caught my reflection briefly in the metal railing near the stage, and what I saw surprised me. I did not see the insecure girl who used to shrink under criticism. I saw a woman who had earned her place through discipline and perseverance. Still, even with that realization, a familiar ache lingered in my chest because no amount of rank or recognition had ever been enough to change how my family saw me. I heard Evan exhale sharply behind me like he was bored already, and Linda leaned closer to him, whispering something that made him snort quietly. My father did nothing. That was the moment I understood with absolute clarity that this ceremony would not soften them or change the script they had written years ago. Whatever happened next would not be because I failed to earn respect. It would be because they were incapable of giving it. I grew up in Plano, Texas, in a quiet neighborhood of trimmed lawns and brick houses where everything looked orderly from the outside and no one ever questioned what happened behind closed doors. My earliest memories of that house are soft ones, my mother humming in the kitchen, the smell of coffee in the mornings, her hand brushing my hair before school. She died when I was 8 years old suddenly, and without warning, and the silence she left behind became the foundation of everything that followed. My father, Mark, did not know how to exist inside grief, so he buried himself in work and left me to navigate the empty spaces alone. Within a year, Linda entered our lives composed, efficient, and decisive, as if she were stepping into a role she had rehearsed long before meeting us. She brought with her a son, Evan, who was a year older than me, and from the beginning it was clear that this family would be rebuilt around him. Linda did not raise her voice often, but her authority was absolute, and her affection had conditions. Evan met those conditions effortlessly. He was loud, charming, and confident, the kind of child teachers remembered and neighbors praised. I was quiet, observant, and careful, traits that rarely drew attention unless something went wrong. Linda praised Evan openly for things as small as finishing his dinner or getting average grades, while my achievements were acknowledged only if they were useful. If I cleaned the kitchen, it was expected. If Evan forgot, it was forgiven. When Evan broke a window roughhousing in the backyard, Linda laughed and said boys would be boys. When I spilled a glass of milk at the table, she sighed heavily and asked why I could not be more careful. That pattern became the rhythm of our household. Evan was celebrated for potential while I was measured by responsibility. As we grew older, the comparisons became sharper and more public. Evan struggled in school, drifting through assignments with excuses that Linda repeated for him. He is creative, she would say. He just needs motivation. When my report cards came home filled with high marks, Linda nodded once and reminded me that grades did not guarantee success. Your brother has charisma, she would say. People like him. You need to learn how to be less rigid. I learned early that excelling quietly was safer than standing out because any attention I drew to myself was quickly redirected toward Evan. If relatives visited, Linda would recount Evan's stories laughing proudly while I sat nearby, invisible, unless someone asked why I was so serious. Mark watched all of this with a distant expression, rarely intervening, and when he did, it was only to suggest that I should be understanding. He meant well, I think, but his passivity taught me that fairness was negotiable and my feelings were optional. By the time we reached our teenage years, the roles were fixed. Evan was the golden child, the one who could do no real wrong, while I became the responsible one, the one trusted to babysit, manage chores, and keep the peace. If Evan skipped class, it was dismissed as rebellion. If I questioned an unfair rule, it was labeled disrespect. Linda often reminded me how lucky I was to have a stable home, as if stability excused imbalance. When Evan needed money for activities or gadgets, Linda found a way to provide it. When I wanted something extra, I was told to save or sacrifice. At 16, I took my first part-time job, not because we needed the money, but because I wanted a sense of control over my own life. Linda praised my initiative, but quickly began assigning expectations to my paycheck. "You can help out now," she said, smiling thinly. Responsibility followed me like a shadow. Evan learned to rely on it. He borrowed money with vague promises of repayment that never came, and Linda waved it away, insisting that family did not keep score. But the score was always kept, and it was always mine to settle. Holidays only sharpened the divide. Evan opened gifts that reflected his interests and ambitions, while mine were practical items, reminders of usefulness rather than identity. If I expressed disappointment, Linda accused me of ingratitude. Evan could complain freely and be heard. I learned to swallow frustration because pushing back only reinforced the idea that I was difficult. Even grief was not evenly distributed. When I struggled quietly with memories of my mother, Linda grew impatient. "Dwelling on the past is unhealthy," she said. But Evan was allowed to rage and sulk whenever he felt slighted. Mark watched from the sidelines, convincing himself that peace was the same as harmony. As I got older, I began to understand that favoritism is not always loud. Sometimes it is subtle choices repeated over years until inequality feels normal. It is praise given freely to one child and withheld from another. It is excuses made for one and expectations imposed on the other. By the time I graduated high school, I had internalized the belief that my value came from what I provided, not from who I was. Evan joked about my seriousness, calling me boring, and Linda echoed it, telling me I needed to loosen up. What they did not see was that discipline was my survival strategy. Order made sense where affection did not. When I talked about leaving Plano, joining the Army, Linda scoffed and Evan laughed. "You are not built for that," Evan said. "You take everything too seriously." But that seriousness was the very thing that carried me forward. Looking back now, I see how those years shaped me. The constant comparisons, the quiet dismissals, the expectation that I would always be the one to adapt and endure. I did not grow up dreaming of medals or recognition. I grew up wanting distance and dignity. And though I did not know it then, the seeds of that ceremony at Fort Cavazos were planted in those Plano years, in a house where love was conditional and respect was unevenly distributed. I joined the United States Army in the summer of 2015 when I was 19 years old, not because I wanted glory or applause, but because I needed structure, the kind that did not shift based on mood favoritism or silence. By then, Plano no longer felt like a hometown. It felt like a holding pattern where every expectation was placed on me and every excuse was reserved for Evan. The house was filled with rules that changed depending on who broke them and praise that never seemed to land in my direction. Discipline was something I craved because it promised clarity. In my world growing up, there were no clear lines, only emotional landmines and unspoken hierarchies. The Army brochure I picked up from a recruiter table at a local college fair was not about adventure to me, it was about order. Rank meant something. Responsibility came with authority. Effort led to outcome. Those concepts felt revolutionary. When I told my family I had signed my enlistment papers, Linda stared at me as if I had announced a personal insult. She did not raise her voice, but her disappointment was sharp and immediate. She asked why I would choose something so rigid when I could stay home, work locally, and help the family. Evan laughed outright, leaning back in his chair and calling it dramatic. "You just want attention," he said. "You will quit once it gets hard." Mark tried to soften the moment by suggesting, "I think it over," but his words lacked conviction. I had already thought it over every night for years. The Army represented distance from constant judgment and a chance to earn respect on terms that were not emotional or arbitrary. Linda warned me that military life would break me, that I was too sensitive, too serious. Evan mocked the idea of me in uniform, telling anyone who would listen that I would never last through basic training. Their opposition only confirmed what I already knew. Staying meant shrinking. Leaving meant choosing myself. I shipped out to basic training at Fort Jackson that fall, and the moment the bus doors opened, I felt something shift inside me. The yelling, the early mornings, the physical exhaustion, none of it scared me. For the first time, expectations were clear and equal. Everyone was tired. Everyone was pushed. No one was favored. When I struggled, I was corrected, not dismissed. When I succeeded, it was acknowledged without qualification. That environment rebuilt something in me that had been worn down by years of quiet dismissal. I wrote letters home at first, hoping that distance might change how my family saw me. Evan never responded. Linda replied once, reminding me that I had chosen a difficult path and should not expect sympathy. Mark said he was proud in a brief, unemotional sentence that felt more like obligation than pride. I stopped waiting for validation and focused on surviving training. I learned to lead by example, to listen more than I spoke, and to carry weight without complaint. Those skills did not come naturally, they were learned through repetition and accountability. I discovered that discipline was not punishment, it was freedom. When I graduated basic training, I stood in formation, feeling taller than I ever had in Plano. Yet when I shared the news, Linda asked whether I would be able to send money home now that I was earning a paycheck. Evan joked that government money must be nice. Nothing had changed. Still, I stayed. I advanced through training, earned respect quietly, and kept my head down. Every promotion, every qualification was a brick laid between me and the life I had left behind. The Army became the place where my seriousness was an asset rather than a flaw. Family gatherings grew more strained when I came home on leave. Evan treated my service like a phase, and Linda minimized it by comparing it to his own plans that never materialized. I listened, endured, and returned to duty without confrontation. Persistence became my shield. I learned that leaving a toxic environment does not erase its influence immediately. It lingers in doubts and habits. But with every year in uniform, those doubts grew quieter. I learned that commitment does not require permission, and that respect earned through action cannot be taken away by mockery. Joining the Army was the first decision I made entirely for myself, and it set me on a path that would eventually force my family to see me clearly whether they wanted to or not. My service years unfolded quietly without dramatic announcements or stories meant to impress, because I had learned early that survival and leadership often happen in the margins where no one is watching. After completing advanced training, I was assigned to a unit where competence mattered more than personality, and consistency earned trust faster than words ever could. My first deployment came sooner than I expected, and with it, the reality of responsibility settled in. I was not in command of large groups or making headline decisions, but I was trusted with small teams' logistics coordination and the kind of leadership that keeps people steady when stress presses in from all sides. I learned how to read exhaustion in a soldier's posture, how to listen when someone needed to talk without saying it, and how to step forward when hesitation could cost time or safety. Those lessons shaped me more than any formal recognition ever could. I never talked much about my work when I called home, because explaining it felt pointless and because I had grown used to minimizing my own experiences. Linda rarely asked what I did overseas, and when she did, it was framed around inconvenience rather than concern. Evan never asked at all. He joked once that sitting in an air-conditioned office must be nice, and I let the comment pass without correction. It was easier that way. During deployment, I sent money home regularly, not because I was asked directly at first, but because hints were dropped in conversations that ended with silence if I did not respond. Linda mentioned rising costs and unexpected expenses. Evan complained about needing help with bills, and Mark sighed heavily about things being tight. I justified it by telling myself that family helped family and that my paycheck could ease tensions even from far away. Over time, the requests became expectations. The amount I sent increased quietly, and the gratitude never followed. When I mentioned needing to save for myself, Linda reminded me that Evan was still finding his way. When I suggested limits, she accused me of becoming selfish since joining the Army. The irony was not lost on me, but I kept sending money anyway because old habits die hard, and responsibility had been assigned to me long before I ever earned it. I learned to stretch my own budget to make it work, cutting personal comforts and delaying plans while convincing myself it was temporary. Evan treated my support like an entitlement, never acknowledging it directly, and occasionally making jokes about how nice it must be to have steady government pay. Those words stung, but I swallowed them the way I always had. In my unit, I was known as reliable, the one who showed up early, stayed late, and filled gaps without complaint. Leadership noticed not because I demanded attention, but because consistency is hard to ignore. I was trusted with mentoring newer soldiers, walking them through procedures, and helping them adjust to the rhythm of service. I never told my family about those responsibilities because I already knew how they would respond. Linda would dismiss it as basic duty, and Evan would mock the idea of me leading anyone. So I kept those victories to myself, letting them build quietly inside me. Deployment life taught me that sacrifice does not always look like dramatic loss. Sometimes it is the steady erosion of personal boundaries, the slow acceptance of imbalance because it feels familiar. When I returned stateside between rotations, the dynamic at home was unchanged. Evan complained about money. Linda hinted at larger needs, and Mark remained silent. I watched as my contributions were absorbed without acknowledgement and realized that my absence had not made them appreciate me more. It had simply made my resources more valuable. Still, I stayed quiet. The Army had taught me endurance, and I applied that lesson to family life even when it hurt. I told myself that sending money was easier than confrontation and that peace was worth the cost. Over time, though, the contrast became harder to ignore. In uniform, my efforts mattered. At home, they disappeared into expectation. I began to see that my silence was enabling a pattern that would never change on its own. Yet I continued because part of me still hoped that loyalty would be returned someday. That hope followed me into each new assignment, each new responsibility, and each quiet sacrifice I made without recognition. What I did not realize then was that every unspoken compromise was building toward a moment when silence would no longer protect anyone, least of all me. The notice came on an ordinary afternoon while I was back stateside finishing routine duties and catching up on paperwork that never seemed to end. I opened my email expecting another schedule update or training reminder and instead saw my name followed by formal language that made me pause. I had been selected to receive an Army Commendation Medal for sustained meritorious service and leadership. I read the message twice, slowly letting the words settle in. There was no surge of excitement, no urge to celebrate out loud, just a quiet sense of validation that made my shoulders relax for the first time in weeks. This was not an award for one dramatic moment, but for consistency, for showing up when it mattered and carrying responsibility without complaint. It felt earned in a way that needed no audience. Still, protocol required family notification and attendance options, and I knew that meant telling them. I waited a full day before calling home, rehearsing the conversation in my head because experience had taught me not to expect enthusiasm. When I told Linda, she paused not to congratulate me, but to ask when and where the ceremony would be held. Her next question was whether there would be photographs and who else would be attending. She wanted to know if senior officers would be present and whether families were expected to dress formally. It became clear quickly that the event mattered to her only as a public appearance. Mark asked about travel arrangements and parking, sounding more concerned with logistics than meaning. Evan laughed lightly on the line and said it sounded official enough to be interesting. No one asked what the award was for. No one asked how it felt. The following days confirmed what I already suspected. Linda began talking about the ceremony as if it were a social obligation rather than a recognition of service. She asked if they would be seated where people could see them and whether there would be time to mingle afterward. She suggested outfits and reminded me that appearances mattered. When I mentioned the award citation, she waved it off, saying medals were common in the military and that what mattered was looking respectable. Evan chimed in during one call, his tone casual and dismissive, saying it was just a piece of metal and that the Army gave those things out all the time. I felt the familiar tightening in my chest, but said nothing. Arguing had never changed his mind, and I refused to let this moment turn into another family debate. Instead, I focused on the practical details, completing forms, confirming attendance, and preparing myself mentally for the ceremony. When I returned home briefly before the event, the dynamic was unchanged. Evan lounged comfortably, offering commentary on the ceremony plans as if he were the expert. Linda reminded me to send her the exact schedule so they would not be inconvenienced by waiting. Mark nodded occasionally, adding nothing of substance. I watched them interact around me, discussing the event as if it were something happening to them rather than because of me. It was strange how invisible I felt in my own achievement. On the drive back to base, I thought about the contrast between the Army and my family. In uniform, effort was documented, acknowledged, and rewarded within a clear system. At home, everything was subjective, filtered through preference and bias. I reminded myself that the award did not exist to change them. It existed because of the work I had done. Still, a part of me hoped that seeing the ceremony might shift something in them. That hope was small and cautious, shaped by years of disappointment, but it lingered anyway. As the ceremony approached, Linda called again to confirm details, asking who would be speaking and whether my commanding officer was important. She seemed pleased by the idea of senior leadership present and suggested that Evan should stand where people could see him as well. Evan joked that he might get mistaken for the one being honored. When I did not laugh, he shrugged it off, saying I took things too seriously. I ended the call early, feeling a mix of resolve and unease. I prepared my uniform with care, pressing each crease, aligning each ribbon, making sure everything was perfect, not for them, but for myself. The night before the ceremony, I lay awake thinking about the path that had led me here, the years of service, the quiet sacrifices, and the moments of doubt I had pushed through alone. I knew my family would be there physically, but emotionally, they had never really arrived. The award notice had changed nothing about that. What it had done was bring all those dynamics into one public space where they would no longer be contained by private walls. I sensed that something was coming not because I could predict it, but because patterns have a way of revealing themselves when exposed to light. Evan had already reduced the moment to a joke, and Linda had framed it as a performance. Mark would likely remain silent as always. I told myself that whatever happened, I would stand steady because I had earned the right to be there. The ceremony was not about changing their minds. It was about acknowledging my own journey even if they never understood it. The shift from quiet tension to public exposure happened so subtly at first that I almost missed it, and that made it worse because humiliation does not always announce itself. It seeps in through small moments that others notice before you do. The ceremony had moved forward with names being called, applause rising and falling in respectful waves, and I stood just off to the side waiting for my turn, aware of every sound behind me. The chairs scraped occasionally, people adjusted their posture, and the Texas sun pressed down with a steady heat that made the air feel thick. I could feel my pulse in my ears, but my face remained neutral because years of practice had taught me how to keep emotion from showing. Then Evan leaned forward again, his voice louder this time, careless and sharp enough to cut through the respectful hush that had settled over the audience. "You are acting like a hero now," he said, his tone exaggerated as if he were narrating a joke to an invisible crowd. For a split second, I wondered if I had misheard him, but the silence that followed confirmed it. A few heads turned, not all of them, but enough. I felt eyes flick toward me, then back toward the third row, trying to place the source of the disruption. Evan did not lower his voice or apologize. He leaned back, smug and satisfied, as if daring someone to challenge him. Linda did not correct him. She shifted in her seat and pressed her lips together, but said nothing, her silence as deliberate as his comment. Mark stared straight ahead, his shoulders stiff, his refusal to intervene painfully familiar. The words settled over me heavier than any accusation because they framed my presence not as service, but as performance. I stood there frozen, not by fear, but by the weight of choice. Years ago, I might have turned around, might have tried to explain or defend myself, but I knew better now. Engaging him would only give the moment more oxygen. Still doing nothing felt like surrender. Around me, I sensed the discomfort spreading a quiet ripple through the rows. A woman 2 seats away glanced toward me with sympathy. An older veteran frowned, his gaze lingering on Evan longer than courtesy allowed. The announcer cleared his throat, continuing with the program, but the atmosphere had changed. Something private had been dragged into the open, and everyone felt it. I kept my eyes forward, my hands steady at my sides, the fabric of my uniform brushing against my skin, grounding me in the present. Inside my chest, though, everything tightened. This was the same script played out in a new setting. Evan diminishing me to elevate himself, Linda allowing it. Mark disappearing behind silence. The only difference was the audience. I could feel the humiliation rising, not because I believed his words, but because they were spoken where respect was expected. This was not a family living room or a private gathering. This was a military ceremony where dignity mattered. The contrast made his comment feel louder, more offensive. A few whispers moved through the rows, and I heard someone murmur that it was inappropriate. Another person shook their head, visibly disapproving. Evan noticed and smiled wider, as if enjoying the attention. I realized then that he believed he still had control, that no matter where we were, he could rewrite my story with a sentence. I stood perfectly still because soldiers are trained to hold position under pressure, but my mind raced through possibilities. Should I turn around and confront him? Should I ask him to stop? Should I walk away? The question hung in the air, heavier than the heat. Would you stay silent or walk away? That moment stretched painfully long, each second amplifying the tension. I felt the familiar urge to make myself smaller, to absorb the discomfort quietly and move on. That instinct had kept peace for years, but it had also cost me pieces of myself. Around me, the ceremony continued, but the focus had shifted. People were no longer just watching the stage, they were watching the dynamic unfolding behind it. Evan shifted again, clearly pleased with the reaction, and muttered something else under his breath, this time quieter but still dismissive. I did not move. I did not respond. I held my position because I knew something he did not. This was not a private exchange that could be dismissed or denied later. This was public, and that mattered. The humiliation he intended for me had already begun to reflect back on him. I could see it in the tightened expressions of those who understood the significance of the moment. Respect, once broken, does not fall quietly. It echoes. As the next name was called and applause filled the space again, I remained still. My posture unchanged, but my perspective altered. This was no longer about enduring quietly. This was about what would happen when authority noticed what entitlement had exposed. The question was no longer whether I would respond, but how the truth would be revealed and who would be standing when it was. The moment that shifted, everything began quietly without drama, the way most turning points do when no one is paying close attention. As the ceremony continued, the line adjusted again, and I stepped a few paces to the side to clear space near the aisle where recipients and officers moved in careful order. The heat had settled into a steady pressure, and the crowd grew restless, shifting in their seats while still trying to maintain decorum. That was when I noticed the older officer standing a few rows ahead of me, struggling slightly as he prepared to move forward. His posture was dignified, but unsteady, his hand tightening around the back of the chair in front of him for balance. He wore his uniform with the ease of someone who had lived in it for decades, but age had slowed him in ways rank could not erase. I hesitated only for a moment because instinct took over long before thought. I stepped forward quietly, offering support without drawing attention, easing my arm beneath his to steady him as he rose. He nodded once in acknowledgement, a simple gesture filled with gratitude but nothing more. To me, it was automatic, the kind of courtesy drilled into us early to look after one another regardless of position. To Evan, it was something else entirely. I heard his voice again this time, sharp and mocking, cutting through the controlled atmosphere with deliberate intent. Showing off again, he said loud enough to carry. A few heads turned sharply, now irritation flickering across faces that had come expecting reverence, not commentary. Linda inhaled sharply but still did not intervene. Mark stared at his hands as if studying lines that might offer escape. I felt the words hit, but I did not withdraw my support. I kept my grip steady, my focus on the officer beside me, because abandoning him would have been worse than enduring a remark. What Evan could not see, what none of them could see yet, was that the man I was helping was not simply an elderly attendee. He was a senior officer from division headquarters, someone whose presence alone altered the tone of the ceremony, even if most did not recognize him immediately. His insignia was understated, his demeanor reserved, but authority radiated from him in a way that made seasoned soldiers straighten unconsciously. As we moved forward, a hush began to creep through the audience, not because anyone had announced anything, but because attention shifted. Conversations stilled and whispers died down, replaced by a subtle awareness that something important was unfolding. The officer paused briefly, turning his head slightly toward me, his voice low and calm, thanking me before continuing forward. That small interaction did not go unnoticed. A few officers near the stage exchanged glances, recognition flickering across their faces. The commanding officer lifted his gaze from the program, scanning the movement with new focus. Evan noticed the change too, but misread it entirely. He leaned back again, clearly pleased with himself, assuming the attention belonged to him. Linda adjusted her posture, smoothing her dress eyes darting around as if suddenly aware of being observed. The silence grew heavier, no longer awkward, but anticipatory. The band members sat perfectly still, instruments resting against their legs, waiting. The master of ceremonies hesitated mid-sentence, then continued slower, his cadence shifting to match the change in energy. I released my hold once the officer was steady and returned to my position, my pulse steady but my awareness sharpened. Years in uniform had taught me how to read rooms, how to sense when authority entered a space even before it spoke. This felt like that moment. Evan whispered again, something under his breath, but it fell flat, swallowed by the quiet. For the first time, his voice did not carry. People were no longer watching me or him. They were watching the officer who had just moved forward, and the officers who now stood a little straighter at the front. I felt a strange calm settle over me. Not relief, not satisfaction, just clarity. Whatever Evan thought he was controlling had slipped beyond him. The silence that followed was not empty. It was weighted with recognition, slowly spreading through the ranks. Someone a few rows back leaned forward, squinting as if trying to confirm what they were seeing. A ripple of restrained murmurs moved through the seated officers near the stage. The commanding officer closed his folder and adjusted his stance, his expression unreadable but intent. I remained still, my hands at my sides, my gaze forward. This was no longer a moment for reaction. It was a moment for observation. Evan shifted again, sensing something was wrong but unable to grasp it. His earlier confidence faded into confusion as the attention he had sought redirected itself elsewhere. The ceremony had not stopped, but it had changed course subtly, decisively. The rank reveal had begun not with an announcement, but with silence, and silence in the military often speaks loudest of all. The turning point did not arrive with shouting or spectacle. It arrived with authority, the kind that does not need to announce itself loudly because it is already understood by everyone in uniform. Lieutenant Colonel James Harrington stepped forward from his place near the podium with measured precision, his posture straight, his movements unhurried, and when he spoke, the entire ceremony adjusted around his voice, as if pulled into alignment. He did not raise his tone or gesture dramatically. He simply waited until the remaining murmurs faded and silence returned in full. That silence was absolute, the kind that only exists when people recognize that what comes next will matter. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington cleared his throat once, then spoke calmly, evenly, and with unmistakable command. Before we proceed, he said, "I want to address something that just occurred." His gaze moved slowly across the formation and then toward the audience, his eyes steady, not searching, but selecting. "In my years of service," he continued, "I have learned that moments of character often reveal themselves not during combat, but during ceremony, when respect is expected without question." The weight of his words settled immediately. Officers near the front straightened. Soldiers shifted subtly, returning to full attention. Evans stopped moving entirely. The lieutenant colonel turned slightly, gesturing toward the older officer I had assisted moments earlier. For those of you who may not be aware, he said that officer is a senior leader from division headquarters whose service spans decades and whose presence here today honors every soldier receiving recognition. A ripple moved through the seated officers, quiet but unmistakable. Recognition dawned across several faces, and with it a visible change in posture. The lieutenant colonel continued, his voice still calm, but edged with steel. "When a soldier steps forward to support a fellow service member, that is not showing off. That is discipline. That is respect. That is exactly what we expect from those who wear this uniform." His eyes shifted, then landing squarely on the third row where my family sat. He did not single anyone out by name. He did not need to. The effect was immediate. Evan froze, his earlier confidence draining from his face as realization crept in. Linda stiffened her hands, gripping her purse too tightly. Mark lowered his head further, as if hoping invisibility might finally work. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington did not pause for reaction. He continued speaking with deliberate clarity, reframing the narrative in front of everyone present. "This ceremony exists to recognize service that is often unseen," he said, "and it demands respect from every person in attendance, whether you wear a uniform or not. Any behavior that undermines that respect reflects not on the soldier being honored, but on the person who displays it." The silence was heavy now, no longer anticipatory, but judgmental. I felt it press against my chest, not with fear, but with an unexpected sense of steadiness. For the first time, someone with unquestioned authority was articulating what I had endured quietly for years. The lieutenant colonel turned back toward the formation, acknowledging the senior officer with a brief nod before addressing the crowd again. "Rank does not always announce itself loudly," he said, "but it commands recognition when it enters a space. Just as character does." That single sentence landed harder than any accusation could have. Evan did not move. He did not smirk or whisper or laugh. He simply stared forward, his mouth slightly open, as if the script he relied on had vanished mid-scene. Around him, the audience shifted, some leaning forward, others shaking their heads in quiet disapproval. The lieutenant colonel closed the distance back to the podium, his presence anchoring the ceremony again. "We will continue," he said, "but let me be clear. What we honor here today is not performance. It is service integrity and respect. Those values are not optional, and they do not bend to ego." He stepped back, allowing the master of ceremonies to resume, but the atmosphere was irrevocably altered. The line between private cruelty and public accountability had been drawn and crossed. I remained still, my heart pounding, but my posture unchanged because this was not my moment to speak. It was my moment to be seen. Evan finally shifted his eyes, darting around the crowd, sensing the weight of attention now focused not on me, but on him. Linda looked down, avoiding eye contact with anyone. Mark remained silent, but his shoulders sagged as if the truth had finally reached him. I realized then that the humiliation Evan intended for me had reversed direction without a single word from my mouth. Authority had done what endurance never could. As the ceremony moved forward, applause sounded different, not polite, but charged with something sharper. Respect had been restored, but the damage was done. Everyone present now understood exactly who had crossed the line and who had stood firm. This was where everything changed. What followed felt like the crest of a wave that had been building for years, unseen but inevitable once it broke. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington remained at the podium, his presence steady and composed, yet the air around him tightened, as if everyone understood that the moment had not passed, it had only sharpened. He did not rush. He allowed the silence to work because silence in a formation is not emptiness, it is attention gathered and focused. Then he spoke again, not loudly, not angrily, but with the precision of someone who knows exactly how much weight each word carries. Leadership, he said, is not measured by volume or bravado. It is measured by restraint, by service to others, and by respect for the institution we represent. His eyes moved across the rows of soldiers, then to the families seated behind them, and finally they settled briefly on the third row. I did not need to turn to know where he was looking. Everyone did. He continued with calm authority. Integrity is what you display when you think no one important is watching. And behavior unbecoming of this ceremony has no place here, regardless of who you are or who you think you are. The phrase landed with unmistakable force. Behavior unbecoming. In military context, it is not a casual criticism, it is a clear line drawn between acceptable conduct and disgrace. A low murmur rippled through the audience, not chatter but recognition. Heads turned slowly, deliberately, and then stopped. All eyes moved in the same direction. Evan sat frozen, his earlier confidence fully erased, replaced by a rigid stillness that betrayed panic. His face had gone pale, his jaw clenched tight, as if he were trying to hold himself together by force. Linda finally lowered her head, her chin dropping toward her chest as though the weight of the moment had become too much to carry upright. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap, fingers twisting together in a gesture that revealed what her silence never had. Mark did not move at all, but the line of his shoulders curved inward, and for the first time I saw something like shame settle over him. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington did not name Evan. He did not need to. The power of the exposure came from its clarity, not its specificity. Everyone present understood exactly who the words applied to, and more importantly, they understood why. The lieutenant colonel continued speaking now, addressing the soldiers directly, but with an undercurrent that reached the audience just as clearly. When we honor service, he said, we honor sacrifice often carried quietly without recognition. Any attempt to diminish that service reflects a failure of character, not a flaw in the soldier. The silence deepened. It pressed down on Evan visibly. He shifted slightly, then stopped as if movement itself might draw further attention. A woman seated near him leaned away instinctively, creating physical distance. An older veteran in the row behind shook his head slowly, his disappointment evident. I stood there, unmoving, my eyes forward, my hands steady at my sides, because there was nothing for me to add. My silence was not weakness in that moment, it was strength. For years, I had been conditioned to explain myself, to soften my achievements, to absorb disrespect quietly. Now authority had spoken for me, and there was no need to dilute it with personal response. Lieutenant Colonel Harrington concluded his remarks with a final sentence that sealed the moment. Respect is not optional in this formation, he said. It is the foundation on which everything else stands. He stepped back then, and the master of ceremonies resumed, but the atmosphere had irrevocably shifted. Applause followed the next name, but it sounded different, tighter, more deliberate. The audience was no longer passive. They were witnesses. Evans stared straight ahead, unable to meet anyone's gaze. The smirk that had once defined him was gone, replaced by an expression caught between disbelief and humiliation. Linda remained bowed her earlier concern, with appearances rendered meaningless by the reality unfolding around her. Mark swallowed hard, still saying nothing, his silence now an indictment rather than avoidance. I felt a strange calm settle over me, not triumph, not satisfaction, but release. The public exposure I had never sought had arrived anyway, not through confrontation, but through truth, articulated by authority. I did not speak. I did not turn. I did not acknowledge them. My stillness became its own statement. In that moment, the roles that had defined my family for decades collapsed under the weight of public accountability. The golden child was exposed. The enabler was revealed. The silent bystander was laid bare. And I stood there unchanged, steady and dignified, because the story they had told about me no longer held power in the light. The ceremony continued, but nothing would ever be the same again. The ceremony ended formally with controlled applause and the measured cadence of tradition, but the real aftermath began the moment people stood from their seats and the structure of rank loosened into social space. Conversations did not resume normally. They fractured into quiet clusters and sideways glances that followed my family wherever they moved. I noticed it immediately, not because I was looking for it, but because it was impossible to miss. Whispers trailed behind Evan as he stood stiffly unsure where to look or where to go. People who had laughed easily moments earlier now avoided his eyes or turned their backs entirely. Respect once withdrawn does not make noise, it simply disappears. Linda tried to recover first, smoothing her expression and straightening her posture, as if composure could erase what had happened. She attempted polite conversation with another family nearby, but the response was curt and distant. The woman nodded once and excused herself, leaving Linda standing alone, clutching her purse with forced calm. Mark hovered uncertainly behind them, his usual position, but this time it offered no shelter. A man he had greeted earlier walked past without acknowledgement, and another offered a tight nod before turning away. Isolation settled around him visibly, and he shrank beneath it. Evan attempted bravado, laughing too loudly at a comment that never landed. His voice sounded thin out of place, and people noticed. A junior officer he tried to engage responded briefly, then moved on. A senior NCO glanced at him with unmistakable disapproval and said nothing at all. That silence carried more weight than any reprimand. Evan was no longer invisible. He was marked. I stood apart, speaking quietly with members of my unit who approached with sincere words of respect. Their tone was different now, warmer and more open. A captain thanked me for my professionalism during the ceremony. A sergeant commented on my composure, saying it reflected well on the unit. The older officer I had assisted earlier stopped briefly to nod in acknowledgement, his eyes kind and steady. Those interactions grounded me in reality, reminding me that what mattered was not the collapse happening behind me, but the integrity recognized in front of me. I did not look toward my family. I did not need to. The shift was palpable. Where they once occupied space easily, they now stood on the margins uncertain and exposed. Evan attempted to reclaim footing by telling a story loudly exaggerating details, but it fell flat. People listened politely at best, then drifted away. His credibility had evaporated in a matter of minutes, undone not by accusation, but by observation. Linda stopped trying after a while, retreating into herself, her earlier concern with appearances rendered useless. She watched others greet me with respect, and something like disbelief crossed her face, as if seeing a version of me she had never acknowledged. Mark lingered near the edge of the crowd, his isolation complete. No one confronted him. No one blamed him directly, but his silence during the incident had spoken volumes, and those who noticed remembered. I felt an unexpected lightness, not because my family was suffering, but because I was no longer carrying their narrative. For the first time, I moved freely without anticipating commentary or dismissal. When I walked past a group, conversations paused not in judgment, but in recognition. People made space. They nodded. They smiled. Respect followed me naturally without effort. That was the greatest contrast of all. I did nothing to earn it in that moment beyond being myself. The social consequences continued even as the crowd thinned. Evan stood alone near the exit, his phone in hand, pretending to text, but clearly stalling. Linda whispered something urgent to Mark, who nodded mechanically, still avoiding eye contact with anyone else. They did not approach me. Perhaps they sensed that the dynamic had shifted beyond repair. As I left the area, a senior enlisted leader stopped me briefly, offering congratulations and thanking me for representing the unit with dignity. His words mattered because they came without agenda. They affirmed what the ceremony had made undeniable. Later, as I walked back toward the parking area, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows across the ground, I felt a sense of closure settle in. The whispers would continue. Stories would circulate. Evan would carry that moment with him into every future interaction within that community. Linda would remember the day appearances failed her. Mark would live with the knowledge that silence can be as visible as action. And I would move forward unburdened by the need to justify my worth. The consequences were not dramatic or loud. They were quiet, lasting, and irreversible. Respect once lost does not return easily, and credibility once shattered cannot be rebuilt through denial. I did not celebrate their discomfort. I simply acknowledged the reality that accountability had arrived without my intervention. As I drove away from Fort Cavazos that afternoon, the weight I had carried for years lifted. The aftermath had settled, and in its place stood something solid. Recognition earned, dignity restored, and a future no longer tethered to the past they had tried to define for me. The audacity did not arrive immediately. It never does. It waited until the dust settled, until the whispers softened into quiet judgments, and Evan had time to feel the full weight of what he had lost. It happened 2 weeks after the ceremony, on an evening when the Texas heat finally eased and the air felt deceptively calm. I was finishing paperwork in my quarters when my phone lit up with his name. I stared at it for a long moment before answering, because part of me already knew why he was calling. His voice sounded different, less confident, strained at the edges as if he were forcing casualness where none belonged. He did not apologize. He never does. Instead, he opened with small talk, asking how I was settling back in as if nothing had happened. I let him speak without interrupting, listening to the careful way he framed each sentence. Then he got to the point. He said things had been difficult since the ceremony, that people had misunderstood him, and that opportunities he expected were suddenly unavailable. He laughed nervously and said maybe the military crowd was too sensitive. Then he asked for a favor. He wanted help finding work. He wanted an introduction to someone in my network, someone who could vouch for him. He said my name carried weight now, and it would mean a lot if I could put it behind his. He even hinted that helping him would smooth things over for the family. The entitlement was so familiar it almost felt comforting in its predictability. I listened quietly, letting him finish without rushing him, because I wanted him to hear himself speak. When he paused, waiting for reassurance, I took a breath and spoke evenly, without anger, without explanation. I told him I was not going to do that. There was a moment of silence on the line, sharp and brittle. He laughed again, this time less convincingly, and said I was overreacting, that family should help each other out. I reminded him calmly that family did not give him permission to belittle me publicly or expect access to what I had earned. His tone shifted, frustration creeping in. He accused me of holding a grudge, of letting a small moment go to my head. That was when I said it clearly, without hesitation. I do not owe you access anymore. The words felt final because they were. He went quiet then, and for the first time, I heard something like disbelief in his voice. He said I was changing, and I agreed. He said Linda would be upset, and I said that was not my responsibility. He said Mark would not understand, and I said he already had his chance. The conversation ended without resolution, without apology, without warmth. I hung up, feeling an unexpected calm settle in my chest. A few days later, Linda reached out, repeating the pattern in a softer tone, asking if I could reconsider for the sake of peace. She framed it as concern, but it was control dressed in politeness. I told her no. She reminded me of everything she had done for me, and I reminded her that support does not erase harm. She ended the call abruptly. Mark sent a short message asking if we could talk. I did not respond. For the first time, I was not negotiating my boundaries. The consequences followed quickly. Evan did not find the help he expected. The introductions he sought never materialized. His reputation within that circle remained damaged, and no amount of explanation could repair it, because the damage was not a misunderstanding. It was observed behavior. I heard through mutual contacts that he was angry, confused, and convinced I had turned everyone against him. The truth was simpler. I had stepped out of the role that made his behavior possible. That refusal changed everything. Saying no did not make me cruel. It made me free. For years, I had mistaken endurance for virtue and silence for strength. Now I understood that boundaries are not punishments, they are protections. Evan had returned expecting the same dynamic to hold, that I would absorb his need and smooth his path at my expense. He miscalculated. As weeks passed, the distance grew, and with it a clarity I had never known. I slept better. I spoke more openly. I felt lighter in ways that had nothing to do with rank or recognition. Have you ever said no and felt free? The answer settled quietly in me with each passing day. I had. And I would never trade that freedom for approval again. The real consequences did not arrive all at once. They unfolded slowly, methodically, the way accountability usually does when it is no longer shielded by excuses. Evan lost opportunities first, the kind he had always assumed would come easily through charm and proximity. A job interview that was supposed to be a formality never led to a callback. A recommendation he expected from an acquaintance quietly evaporated. People who once returned his messages promptly now responded days later, if at all. Within military-connected circles, his name carried a story, and it was not one he controlled. No one needed to confront him directly. They had witnessed enough. Linda tried to intervene, making phone calls, reaching out to people she believed still owed her something, but those efforts only highlighted how isolated they had become. Influence does not survive exposure. Mark withdrew further, retreating into work in silence as the structure he relied on collapsed. Without my compliance, the family dynamic lost its balance. There was no one left to smooth tensions or absorb fallout. Arguments erupted between Linda and Evan, accusations flying about who was responsible for what went wrong. I heard about it secondhand through relatives who no longer spoke in hushed tones. The golden child narrative fractured under pressure, revealing resentment and entitlement beneath it. Linda blamed Evan for embarrassing the family. Evan blamed her for not protecting him. Mark blamed himself quietly in the only way he knew how, by disappearing. I watched from a distance without intervening because I finally understood that rescuing them would only delay their reckoning. Evan's frustration turned outward. He complained loudly about unfair treatment, about being judged too harshly for a single moment. But the truth was that moment had not created the judgment, it had revealed it. People no longer saw potential, they saw character. The doors that closed did so politely, firmly, and without explanation. Linda reached out again weeks later, this time with urgency in her voice, asking if I could help Evan find footing anywhere, even outside my circle. I told her gently but firmly that I would not. She accused me of abandoning family, and I told her that I was choosing myself. The conversation ended badly, and we did not speak again. Mark sent one final message apologizing for not standing up for me. I read it carefully, acknowledging the effort but recognizing that apology without change does not rebuild trust. I did not respond. The family as I had known it unraveled quietly. Holidays passed without invitations. Group messages went silent. Evan stopped reaching out altogether, likely realizing that leverage no longer existed. I felt grief not for what was lost, but for what had never truly been there. Acceptance came slowly, but it came. I focused on my work, poured energy into my unit and my growth. Leadership noticed the difference, not because I worked harder, but because I carried less weight. I was clearer, more decisive, more present. The absence of constant emotional labor freed me to lead more effectively. I did not celebrate Evan's losses. I acknowledged them as consequences long overdue. He had built his identity on entitlement, and when that collapsed, there was nothing beneath it. Linda faced the reality that favoritism corrodes relationships rather than strengthening them. Mark faced the cost of silence. None of that was mine to fix. I had spent enough years being the responsible one carrying burdens assigned without consent. Now I chose restraint. Distance became my protection. Time passed, and the sharpness of the situation softened into something steadier. I learned that justice does not always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like stepping aside and allowing people to face the results of their own actions. I no longer monitored their lives or wondered how they were doing. I trusted that whatever unfolded was necessary. Bethany no longer rescued anyone. She stood firm, grounded in the truth that boundaries are not abandonment. They are the line between survival and self-respect. Healing did not arrive as a sudden sense of peace or a dramatic turning point. It arrived quietly through repetition, through choices made daily that prioritized clarity over obligation and growth over guilt. For the first time in my adult life, I allowed myself to acknowledge that what I had experienced was not normal family conflict, but a long pattern of emotional imbalance that had shaped how I saw myself. I began therapy at the suggestion of a senior officer who noticed the change in my demeanor after the ceremony. He did not pry or demand explanations. He simply said that strong leaders invest in their mental health the same way they invest in physical readiness. That framing mattered to me. Therapy became a structured space where I could unpack years of conditioning without judgment. I learned language for experiences I had always minimized. Favoritism, emotional neglect, learned responsibility, survivor guilt. Naming those things did not make me weaker. It made me precise. Each session peeled back layers of belief I had carried unquestioned, that my value came from usefulness, that love had to be earned through sacrifice, that silence was the price of belonging. Letting go of those beliefs was uncomfortable at first because they had once kept me safe. But safety is not the same as health. At the same time, I found mentorship within the Army that reshaped how I understood leadership. A senior female officer took me aside after noticing my composure during high-pressure situations. She did not reference the ceremony directly. She did not need to. She spoke instead about presence, about how authority begins internally long before it is acknowledged externally. She encouraged me to speak with confidence, not apology, and to trust my judgment without constantly seeking validation. Under her guidance, I stepped into roles that challenged me, stretching my capacity in ways I had once avoided out of habit. I began leading larger teams, facilitating discussions and making decisions without second-guessing myself. The difference was immediate and measurable. Soldiers responded not because I asserted control, but because I was clear-grounded and consistent. Leadership felt lighter now that it was not burdened by the need to prove worth. I noticed subtle changes in myself outside of work as well. I slept more deeply. I laughed more easily. I stopped rehearsing conversations that would never happen. The guilt that once followed me everywhere faded, gradually replaced by discernment. I learned that guilt is not always a sign of wrongdoing. Sometimes it is a signal that you are breaking a pattern others relied on. Releasing that guilt was an act of self-respect. I stopped monitoring my family from a distance, stopped wondering whether I should reach out or explain myself. I accepted that healing does not require closure from those who caused harm. It requires commitment to your own well-being. My world grew quieter but also richer. Friendships deepened because they were no longer crowded out by obligation. Professional relationships flourished because I showed up fully present. I stopped shrinking my accomplishments in conversation and started acknowledging them without discomfort. Not with arrogance, but with honesty. I had earned my place. The Army recognized that growth formally as well, placing me under consideration for increased responsibility and leadership development opportunities. The recognition felt different this time, not like proof, but like alignment. I was where I belonged because I chose to be. Therapy helped me understand that boundaries are not walls. They are doors with locks, and you decide who has the key. I no longer feared being seen as difficult or ungrateful. I feared returning to a version of myself that believed endurance was the same as strength. Healing taught me that strength includes rest, discernment, and self-trust. Growth became less about upward movement and more about internal stability. I was no longer defined by my family role or by reaction to their behavior. I was defined by my values, my discipline, and my capacity to lead with integrity. The absence of guilt was not emptiness. It was space. Space to grow, to lead, and to live without carrying what was never mine to begin with. The victory did not arrive with applause or announcements. It arrived quietly in the form of an email marked routine and a conversation that felt almost understated given how much it meant. I was informed that I had been placed under promotion consideration and recommended for a new posting that aligned with my skill set and leadership trajectory. There was no dramatic reveal, no celebratory phone call to family, just a clear acknowledgement from the institution I served that my work mattered and that I was trusted with more responsibility. The moment felt different from every recognition before it because I no longer needed it to validate me. It confirmed what I already knew. I had grown into someone capable, steady, and self-directed. The new posting offered distance not just geographically, but emotionally. It represented a chance to build a life that was not defined by reaction or recovery, but by intention. As I prepared for the transition, I noticed how little anxiety accompanied the change. In the past, every move had carried the weight of expectation and explanation. This time, it felt clean. I was not leaving anything unfinished. I was choosing forward motion. Colleagues congratulated me with sincerity, and a few commented on how grounded I seemed. One said it looked like I had found my stride. I smiled because that was exactly how it felt. There was no urge to prove anything to anyone outside my circle. The ceremony at Fort Cavazos had closed a chapter I did not realize was still open. The quiet victory lay in the fact that I did not look back. I did not wonder how my family would react or whether Evan would hear about it. Their absence from my thoughts was the clearest sign of healing. I chose peace not as retreat, but as strength. Peace meant no longer rehearsing arguments or preparing defenses. It meant trusting my instincts and honoring my limits. I set up my new space carefully, making it a place that reflected who I had become rather than who I had been surviving as. I established routines that supported balance and clarity. I stayed connected to mentors who challenged me and friendships that nourished me. When people asked about my family, I answered briefly without bitterness or elaboration. Their story was no longer mine to tell. I understood then that quiet victory is not about winning against someone else. It is about winning yourself back. The promotion consideration mattered because it reflected growth earned through discipline, not drama. The new posting mattered because it offered opportunity without strings attached. But the most significant choice was internal. I chose calm over chaos. I chose boundaries over guilt. I chose myself without apology. Looking back, I realized that my silence once protected them. It absorbed tension, smoothed conflict, and kept uncomfortable truths hidden. That silence had a purpose once, but it no longer served me. Now what protected me was clarity, values, supportive community, and the understanding that I am allowed to build a life that feels whole. The victory was quiet because it did not need witnesses. It was complete because it was mine. When I think back to the ceremony at Fort Cavazos now, it feels less like a single day and more like a dividing line between two versions of my life. I remember the heat, the flags, the measured cadence of commands, and the weight of my uniform on my shoulders. I remember standing still while everything shifted around me and realizing in real time that something old was ending. At the time, I could not name it. I only knew that the familiar pressure to explain myself to soften my presence or manage other people's reactions had vanished. Looking back, I understand that moment clearly now. It was the day I stopped needing approval from the people who taught me to doubt my worth. For years, I believed that if I worked hard enough, endured quietly enough, and gave generously enough, I would eventually earn acceptance. That belief shaped my choices and justified my silence. The ceremony stripped that illusion away publicly and irrevocably. Approval withheld is not something you can earn back through sacrifice. It is something you outgrow. I no longer replay Evan's words or Linda's silence in my head. They do not hold power because they no longer define the frame of my life. What stays with me instead is the stillness I felt when authority spoke the truth without my prompting and how that truth stood on its own. That was justice not loud or punitive, but unmistakable. Quiet justice does not chase vindication. It lets reality speak for itself. I learned that boundaries are not cruelty. They are clarity. They are the difference between living in reaction and living with intention. Saying no does not make you heartless. It makes you honest. Choosing distance does not mean you lack loyalty. It means you recognize harm. I spent years confusing responsibility with obligation and silence with strength. Now I know better. Strength is discernment. Strength is choosing peace even when chaos feels familiar. Freedom arrived not as escape, but as alignment. My life now is not built around managing other people's emotions. It is built around values that hold steady regardless of who approves. I lead without apology. I serve with integrity. I rest without guilt. The dignity restored that day was not granted by rank or ceremony. It was reclaimed by refusing to participate in a dynamic that diminished me. I did not raise my voice. I did not confront anyone publicly. I simply stood still long enough for the truth to surface. That is the lesson I carry forward. You do not have to fight every battle to win your life back. Sometimes you only have to stop protecting the people who hurt you. If you have ever been betrayed by family, if you have ever been silenced in the name of peace, or taught that your worth depended on compliance, know this. You are not wrong for wanting respect. You are not cruel for setting boundaries. And you are not alone. Quiet justice is still justice. Freedom is still freedom even when it arrives without celebration. Dignity restored does not announce itself. It settles in and stays. If you have ever been betrayed by family, share your story. Someone needs it.